Good morning, everybody. Welcome. As a reminder, we have a new listening assist system here in the parish hall. So if this can be an echoey place, spoken word is hard in this space. It's actually great for performances of music, but spoken word can be hard to hear in this space. If you're struggling to make out what I or others are saying, there's some listening assist devices by the coffee pot, and we've got plenty for this space. So there are two back there. If you need one, please help yourself. I'm glad to be with you. This is the last in our current series, and I'll say more about what's coming next in a moment. But let's begin our time today with a prayer. Again, this is a prayer from the prayer book, which I like the language. I've chosen to keep the right one, the Elizabethan language, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue smoothly, but does convey kind of the magnitude of this prayer, I think, more effectively than contemporary English. But let's pray this prayer as we start together. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, who settest the solitary in families, we commend to thy continual care the homes in which thy people dwell. Put far from them, we beseech thee, every root of bitterness, the desire of vainglory, and the pride of life. Fill them with faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, patience, godliness. Knit together in constant affection those who in holy wedlock have been made one flesh. Turn the hearts of the parents to the children, and the hearts of the children to the parents, and so enkindle fervent charity among us all, that we may evermore be kindly affectioned one to another through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. There's some resonances in that prayer and Sarah Milford's sermon today. Maybe you'll hear those, or maybe you've already heard those. Elizabeth, would you run the microphone for us today? That's helpful. Thank you. If you're new to this class, don't forget that there are people watching online on our YouTube channel. And although you might speak loudly enough for those in the room to hear you, I promise that without that microphone, people at home will not know what you have said. So it's helpful if you'll use the microphone. So it's been an unusual series. I don't usually do series like this. I like to talk about the Bible, and there aren't as many Bible-related questions or comments to be found in this series, but it's a short 3-week series on Friedman's Fables. I don't think I mentioned last time, but I did 2 times ago, that Edwin Friedman was a rabbi and a therapist. He specialized in family systems, and he was one who identified the ways in which congregations function like families, and families that are complicated systems or webs. And I think sometimes we underestimate the significance that someone in our family, what's happening in their life, the significance that is in our own lives. It's not an accident that if your spouse's sister is having a hard time, that your daughter might also be having a hard time, even though they don't live together. Those things are related, like ripples across a pond. They come to us, sometimes in surprising ways, and sometimes we're able to see the ways in which they're affecting us, which kind of gives us some security. Edwin Friedman wrote this book of Fables. We're only reading a few of the Fables, but he wrote this book of Fables kind of as a playful way to help expose to us some of the challenges that we face as human beings in relationship. I wish I could tell you that I chose this series around Thanksgiving on purpose. I did not. But I do think that these family dynamics surely have come to the fore in the last few days, and perhaps it hits too close to home, or maybe it's just a relief to know that we're not the only ones who have a hard time around a table with people we are supposed to love. Next week, we'll begin a short series, and the shape of the series hasn't quite come together all the way. We do know that next week, the children will be coming and performing a canticle for us. The children's focus will be an Advent canticle. Next week is the first Sunday in Advent. And so we're going to start a series on some of the canticles of Advent, some of the songs, poems appropriate for Advent. And so we'll look at that series. So next week we'll start that Advent series that will take us up until Christmas Eve. So look forward to that with me. As a reminder of where we've been, these are not my titles. These are titles from the sections in Friedman's books, Friedman's Fables. There are 4 sections. We're only looking at 3 of them in this series. The first, failure of syntax. Last week we looked at demons of resistance, and this week we're going to look at bonds and binds. But before we do that, I want to turn in my book to the introduction that Edwin Friedman wrote for this section. And this is a very short introduction, but let me read it. Hearing this introduction, I think, will make it a little clearer why these fables are of interest to Friedman. So let me read this. This is the introduction to this chapter in his book. There is a curious connection between the way people think and the way people bond. To the extent they tend to frame life's issues in black and white, either or, on and off alternatives, to that extent their responses to the challenges of life will lack resiliency. And the more likely it is that their bonds will become binds. On the other hand, to the extent individuals are unafraid of ambiguity and can even come to appreciate its value, then the repertoire of their relational responses is broadened, and that in turn will enrich the alternatives in their style of thinking. It's that relationship between bonds and binds. When bonds of affection become binds that bind us, that's what I'm interested in looking at today. The first story is fairly short, so I wonder if one person might read the first story from us. It's on the screen. I have not printed it out for you because it's under copyright, but I'll let you look over my shoulder and read from the screen. Who would read for us, please, this story of Jean and Jane? And Elizabeth will bring the microphone to you. Thank you.
Jean and Jane. Jean and Jane were very good friends, but Jean and Jane were in no way alike. For Jane was very friendly, always cheerful, always happy, but Jean was more reflective, rarely laughing, rarely smiling. While Jean stayed pretty much to herself, even in groups, Jane was the life of every party. While Jane entered any room and immediately attracted a crowd, Jean entered any room and remained so inconspicuous it was as if she were not there. Jean was not really less attractive, yet she attracted less. Jane was not really a superficial butterfly, yet she was never alone. As time went on, Jean began to worry about the difference. Why is it, she thought, that Jane always has more fun? Why is it that I, on the other hand, am always so unhappy? Does Jane simply know better how to win friends and influence people? If so, where did she learn it, and why haven't I? Jean learned it. Why haven't I, Jean? Learned it. Jean reflected on her own patterns and came to see that there was no clear reason for their difference. She and Jane were the same age, had about the same physical attributes. Okay, Jane was a blonde, but some men liked brunettes. They each could sing, each played about the same game of tennis. Okay, Jane was a better swimmer, but she couldn't play golf. The more Jean thought about Jane, the more depressed she became. It was not just envy. Jane was the reflection of her, Jean's own potential. Jane, right now, in the present, was all that Jean ever wanted to be, but somehow found herself unable to be. As Jean brooded about this problem, things worsened. She isolated herself more. Then she functioned less. Eventually, she stopped going out at all, and who would have wanted to be around her anyway? Throughout this time, Jane continued on her way. Almost every evening, the phone rang. At the club, she was invited to every activity, for she was, after all, a pleasure to be with. Even at work, others admitted that they worked harder in her presence, and she almost never had to eat by herself. Finally, Jean, with great effort, managed to establish a relationship with a therapist. Weekly she went, and she began to discuss her problem, how no one seemed to want her, how she was usually left out of things, if not completely ignored, how jealous she was of Jane. Slowly she talked about her own behavior. Carefully she revealed her inner feelings. Hesitantly she discussed her past. As time went by, she made progress, but it always seemed to be overshadowed by Jane, who, if this was possible, became even more popular than before. Thus Jane continued to be a reminder to Jean of what a woman could be. Ha, thought Jean one day, about 6 months after she had began to work on her problems. Why, if Jane ever had to see someone for professional help, she'd probably be through in a matter of weeks. It was in the midst of one of these doldrums that Jean, upon entering her therapist's office, was astonished to see Jane coming out. "Hi, Jean," said Jane in her usual cheery way. "Hi," responded Jean, surprised. "What are you doing here?" asked Jane sweetly. "Me," said Jean. "Why, I've been coming here for almost a year. This is my regular weekly appointment. What brings you here today?" "Well, we had to switch today. I've been seeing the doctor for several years now," said Jane, still her usual eager self. "I wish I could cut down to only once a week." "But how often do you come?" inquired Jean incredulously. "Usually 3 times, but sometimes if I'm really desperate, he fits me in for a 4th. "Desperate?" exclaimed Jean. "Oh, yes," responded Jane. "You know, Jean, I can't tell you how surprised I am to find you here. You always seem to be so sure of yourself. You're always so self-reliant, always so able to be alone. You have no idea how I admire your independence, your tolerance for solitude, your capacity to keep your distance." Jean was still trying to come from behind the other side of the mirror as she finally asked, "But Jane, what's your problem?" "You mean you can't tell?" chirped Jane. "I am totally unable to say no."
Thank you. Take a look at your handout, and I want to ask first, these morals are not mine. They're given by Edwin Friedman. The moral that he provides for this fable is the grass is only greener when you're not caring for your own lawn. What do you think he means by that? And as you imagine how it might fit in your own experience, or maybe not yours, the experience of somebody else, your neighbor or your sister or your cousin, never us, right? But what do you think that means? What do you think it means the grass is only greener on the other side when you're not caring for your own lawn? What's Friedman trying to teach us? If you'll raise your hand, Elizabeth will bring you the microphone. Yeah, Lark up front.
Perhaps taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
Sometimes your perception of yourself is different than what others perceive of you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Ray?
If you don't cultivate your own inner life, you'll become impoverished, no matter how rich your outer life is.
Thank you. Back up front.
I think sometimes we don't appreciate introverts, and so if we see an extrovert, we assume that they're happy, and I think that the introvert assumed the same thing.
Yeah, thank you. I, before I moved here, worked at a church, and our youth minister was profoundly introverted. Delightful, faithful, profoundly introverted. Good at her job, but in different ways than I'm good at my job, right? You can probably tell I'm an extrovert. At one point, I got a complaint about her from not people that knew her well, but people who thought she was rude. Why is our youth minister so rude? And I thought, okay, great, we need to talk about that. And so she and I met, we talked about that, and sort of that kind way that you say to your boss when your boss is an idiot. She basically said, there's nothing wrong with being an introvert. And so what I really realized very quickly was that my job in helping her succeed was to celebrate her identity as an introvert, and that doesn't come naturally for me. Like, I read this story, and I fall into the trap, right? I know exactly who's happy and who's not, right? But what do I know, right? Yeah. I'm hooked by my own extroversion, by my own, the lens through which we've been taught to see the world. Yeah. What else would you say about that moral? The grass is always greener when you're not caring for your own lawn. So what are we supposed to do about that? What does it mean to care for our own lawn? What does it mean to care for ourselves in that way? Yeah.
I think it could be whenever you're addressing your own problems, you begin to see that others have problems as well. So while you may envy that person for other attributes, you can recognize that they're dealing with things you may not be able to recognize.
Yeah. Yeah, so the work that we are invited to do is different when it's not focused on a comparison, right? It is valuable for us to care for ourselves and to ask, are we happy? And if not, why aren't we happy? And what might we do about that, right? It's one thing for, I get them mixed up, it's one thing for Jean to say, I want to be more active. It's another thing for her to say, why can't I be like Jane, right? And that's a difference. And sometimes those comparisons actually inhibit our ability to do that important work. Yeah, Brandy.
There's something that I say to my clients a lot, and it's comparison breeds discontent, because we really don't know. Like, this is very classic, oh, that person's happier. Well, not necessarily. You don't know what's going on in their life.
Yeah.
You're just different.
Yeah.
And then I say, you be you. Like, whatever that is, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that tendency to compare is exacerbated by the way the world values extroverts. In this case, extroverts over introverts, right? Or, name it, right? Whatever the stereotype or the bifurcation that society would impose upon someone. Oh, you're not like that, you're like this. Sometimes we fall into that trap. We let other people define our own expectations of ourselves, and that leads to that comparison. Yeah. So the first two questions, I'm going to ask them together. Like, if you were a beloved friend, let's not pretend to be therapists yet. Let's pretend to be beloved friends. If you were neither Jean nor Jane, but you wanted to assure them that they were okay, and I use that term okay as Friedman does in the largest sense. Like, what are the words that you might use as a friend to tell Jean or Jane, the introvert or the extrovert, that they're okay? What language would you use to help them find that? Yeah, Trent, thank you.
Just valuing your own way.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes when we envy someone else, we're not really valuing what we have.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe that's to celebrate their way, right? Yeah. Yeah, Ray?
I would say that I would point out that psychology is a social science, and so it has some slop in it, but part of the scientific consensus of psychology is that people have different personality styles. And it's well established that the Jean person is a kind of person, and it's well established that the Jane person is a kind of person. Yeah. And the way to happiness is not to try to become a different kind of person, but to more drill down into the essence of those different styles.
Yeah. 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 What else would you offer? Yeah.
I'm not really answering your question.
That's okay.
But I think a lot of times the introvert, well, it's shown here, doesn't understand the extrovert. And there's assumptions that are made, and then you have a hard time, getting past that.
Yeah.
Because of what you said about society values the extrovert.
Yeah.
And we assume that the extrovert has everything going for them, when in fact they don't,
Yeah. 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 My mother's parents, he was a profound introvert. She was a profound extrovert. And my mother didn't give me much relationship advice, but she did say, attend to that. Like, if you need socialization, and as a child, it felt more this way. It's less so now. Socialization doesn't really depend on couples as much as it used to. Like, when my mother's parents were in the prime of their life, women didn't go out by themselves, right? I mean, you always had a partner with you. It changed a lot. But I remember even as a child trying to make sense of what that meant, and my mother would articulate the ways in which her mother was frustrated because her never wanted to do things with her mother, and her mother, all she wanted to do was go out, and sometimes it's the failure of communication. I'm not sure my grandmother appreciated what a burden it would have been for my grandfather to leave the house, and vice versa. Yeah, sometimes we just don't know. And it's different when we're yoked to someone, partner, close friend or child, different perhaps when it's, in this case, where Jean and Jane don't seem to circle around each other quite as much. Let me ask, what kind of mother do you think each one would make? What kind of mother would that look like? Yeah, Jeremiah.
Okay, so I'll answer your question, but I also have to use my own personal experiences to answer it. Like my friend Ellery is an extreme introvert, and I'm more of an extrovert, and I'm more social, and I like to talk to people. So, so from my own experience, like, it's not that one or the other is more happy. We just have our own way of, dealing with life.
Yeah.
And one is more, but so I think the more introverted one would be more of a, attentive parent.
Yeah.
And very nurturing, whereas, but also the extrovert can be nurturing and teach, their child to socialize and to make friends and be the life of the party. But you can't always assume that one is happier than the other, the introvert or the extrovert.
Yeah.
They both might be intently happy with where they are, but they just have a different way of interacting with people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thanks. Thank you. Who else? Who else? Yeah. Up front, Lark.
Sometimes I think the extrovert parent might want to be a fixer because they're out so much and they see so many people and they want to kind of fix it for their kids. Do you know what I'm talking
Sure.
about? Like,
Sure.
Sometimes that's good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to let kids kind of make their way too,
Yeah.
whether they're an extrovert or introvert.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm an extreme extrovert, and I process everything on the outside. Like, I can't make sense of something unless I have somebody to talk to about it. Right? It's my friend Bill Blackerby, priest in Birmingham. They have 2 children. Ann and Bill have 2 children, and their daughter is the extreme extrovert. Everybody else in the family is an introvert. And they get in the car and they say, can we just have like 30 minutes of quiet? And the daughter would say, well, how will I know what I think if I'm not able to say it out loud? And I identify with that. So as a parent, the challenge is, like, I can't not say it. Even if I'm not trying to fix it, I can't not say it. Like, that's a mistake. That's a problem. That's not going to work out well. Like, the introvert sort of lets people discover it on their own. I can't think it unless it comes out, right? Yeah.
I think the extrovert parent could go one of 2 ways. They could be a helicopter parent, or they could be so involved with their own social life that they ignored the child. So I think that could go either way. And the introvert parent might come across as not very caring, but would probably let the child find their own way.
Yeah.
So I think it could go either way.
Yeah, and I think, right behind you, Lisa.
I was just going to add too, I think it depends on their self-awareness of who they are. And I think we saw that in the parable that it took going to the therapist to kind of gain some of that self-awareness. Yeah. Jane was more self-aware than Jean, even though she couldn't fix her problem without the therapist. I'm an extreme extrovert married to an extreme introvert, and realizing that, naming it, claiming it, having words for it has made it, we just celebrate each other's strengths, and it works out really well. That's why I'm here with my children. That's why my husband's not here. He would not come to this and share feelings.
Yeah.
But he goes to church and does, internal. And so I think just that self-awareness of who you are and knowing your partner has made it an amazing difference, because I did not understand extreme introvert until I was married to one.
Yeah, if both of them are sort of healthy and self-differentiated, then they're going to be great parents, right? It's when they're not. It's when we're hooked by that, right? And again, I think there's something about the grass being greener. That part of this parable is not just what's life like as extroverts or introverts. It's allowing sort of what we perceive in others to begin to define us in ways that we're not self-differentiated. We get hooked in that way. Trent, up front. Yep. And then I'm going to ask another question, and we're going to move on to the next fable.
Well, one thing I found, interesting in the parable is both of these women had been doing a fair amount of therapy, one a lot more than the other, and yet still there was this surprising conversation between them. And it just reminds me of how, I assume things are going great in other people's families. And I was at a reunion and shared some struggles we were having. And once I shared that, I found that other people were having the same struggles.
Yeah.
Maybe not exactly the same, but we're struggling.
Yeah.
So the importance of not just the inner work of therapy, but talking and being willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah. Being secure enough to be vulnerable, especially in those relationships that matter to us. Let me just, without growth from the parable, given the Jane and the Gene that you read about in the parable, who would rather have Jane as a friend? Who would rather have Gene as a friend? Jane's the extrovert. Who would rather have Jane the extrovert as a friend? Who would rather have Gene the introvert as a friend? Look at us. Yeah. All right, let me ask this question for reflection. When you think about the Bible and the stories in the Bible, there are lots of parent-child relationships in the Bible. There are fewer friend relationships in the Bible. Are there any friend relationships in the Bible that you find kind of as an example or a model for how we might not fall into this Jane and Gene trap? And I don't just mean extroversion, introversion, but are there any friendships that you can think about in the Bible where they get past the unspoken expectations and the work of comparison? Any scriptural examples that you can think of? There aren't a lot of friends in the Bible. Yeah, Ray? Yep.
Well, there's David and Jonathan, but frankly, the relationship seems opaque to me. I don't really.
Yeah.
It's just a slogan to me.
Yeah,
Do you have some insight?
That one comes to mind, and I think Jonathan. You remember Jonathan was Saul's son, David's rival's son, and their soulmates, sort of the knit togetherness of Jonathan and David was remarkable. I think in some ways the fact that they were able to transcend the roles that society would have expected them to play. Right? Everybody expects them to be enemies, and yet somehow that becomes an example of friendship. That's one that I had in mind. Another one I had in mind was Jesus and Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And I think about in John when Lazarus has died and Jesus comes and finds Mary and Martha grieving, just the way that sort of Jesus is moved by their loss and yet not completely sort of consumed by it. Anyway, I kind of want to ask, what are some other examples of friendship that the Bible might, maybe Naomi and Ruth, but maybe we would say actually that's almost a codependent relationship. Maybe that's a bad example. I don't know. Anyway, all right. Well, let's look at the next fable, and this one's a little stranger. I'll warn you, but we're going to split it in half. It's called attachment. Let me find it. There it is. We're going to split it in half. Would somebody read the first half, and I'll just tell you when to stop. We'll sort of stop. You won't know when it's the middle, but I'll know when it's the middle. Who would read the first half for us? Thank you. And who would read the second half for us? Thank you. Jason on the other side of the room. Thank you.
Attachment. Once upon a time, a storm-tossed ship gave up one of its passengers. He clung to debris that had gone over the side with him and floated for a few hours. Finally, he could hold on no longer, and he let go. When he came to, he found himself on an uncharted island. The island was perfect. Tall palms, verdant brush, sparkling hills. Hardly believing it was real, he tried to wake himself from his dream. There was some fear that if he succeeded, he would find himself dead. It appeared, however, that he was very much alive. Curiosity and hunger moved him to explore. As he invaded the jungle's depths, he was struck by the calm. There were no loud cries of birds or beasts, and there seemed to be, if anything, a certain order everywhere. He spent most of that first day feasting with his eyes and mouth. Many delicious fruits and nuts were easily available to his reach, and his stomach was soon satisfied. But so wondrous were the colors. The more his eyes took in, the more he wanted to devour. As the first evening came on and he prepared for sleep, he found that the climate, while cool, was in no way chilling. Wearily, he lay down to bed upon a mattress of soft leaves, thankful to be still alive, yet a little scared at being so alone. When he woke the next morning, he was no longer by himself. Sitting all about him in a circle were men, women, and children, some of the most beautiful men, women, and children he had ever seen. They had taken care not to awaken him, and they had brought gifts. But did they think he was a god? As he bestirred himself, they came over, offering food and drink. One who seemed to be a leader appeared to be asking if he were ill or hurt. He did not speak their language, but they easily understood his gestures. He quickly discovered that theirs, too, were easily understandable. Indeed, he found that everything about these people was simple and graceful. They accepted him immediately and made him one of them. He learned their ways of communication. But there was one idea he was totally unable to convey, that at times he wanted to be by himself. On this island, no one was ever left alone. When a baby was born, the people did not sever the umbilical cord. The child thus remained extremely close to its mother throughout its infancy. If the mother wanted to have another child, the umbilical cord was severed, but only from the mother, and her end was then reattached by a simple surgical procedure to one of the other women that continued to care for the child until it was ready to mate. As part of the wedding ceremony, the future partner's cords were severed, but again, only the ends that were connected to the parent surrogates. And as each loose end was attached to the intended spouse, the bride and groom were thus united. In those cases where a mother had had only one child, the cord was reattached directly from natural mother to spouse. Shortly before a wife was to give birth, the husband and wife had their cords unjoined, and the husband could then become attached to another female, ready to leave her mother or mother surrogate. He also had the option of rejoining with his own mother if she had not rejoined with her husband, or he could join again with some mother surrogate, perhaps his original one.
Thank you. Let's switch. You can see where this is going.
While to our modern sense, the way of bonding might seem primitive, even uncivilized, the effects of the constant attachment on society were astounding. Anger was unknown, depression was easily cured, crime was unheard of, envy and jealousy never spawned, and competition and rivalry were total absent. There was no such thing as embarrassment, nor any of those behavior patterns that we have come to call neuroses. If there was fear or anxiety, it was experienced only during that period of time when someone accidentally lost a partner. Such loss was always replaced as soon as possible. However, and the anxiety would quickly subside, indeed it was probably only because the islanders remembered these instances of loss that some sense of closeness was known at all. Despite this, the expected death of a family member never increased anxiety greatly, because everyone had the assurance that the family would quickly make a replacement available. Such backup also may have meant that the individuals were freer to die. The man spent many years on the island, at one point becoming attached to a woman with whom he found mutual attraction. But he soon realized that he could not suffer her omnipresence, and rather than introduce the spoliation of bickering to those lovely people, he asked for a separation. There was perhaps one time when he thought he had found a woman who he might have tried his way of life, but she changed her mind at the last minute and soon tied the knot with another. As he retold it later, her change of mind seemed to have less to do with any failure of nerve on her part than with a concern to calm her own family. They seemed to be becoming increasingly upset over the prospect of their daughters living unattached. After several years, the proverbial ship appeared, and he left these wonderful people sadly. As always, he was surrounded by their reaction, this time to his departure, for as kind and close as they seemed, they now appeared to take his loss with perfect equanimity. In fact, he found himself wondering if they had ever cared at all. Whereas he, though he had been unable to be totally a part of their life, now found himself almost totally unable to separate. When he returned home, his family was overjoyed to see him again, though his wife, thinking he had died, had soon remarried. He himself remarried shortly thereafter, and the path of the loss subsided. He tried to publish an account of his experiences in several scholarly journals, but they all said it was too fantastic. He finally sold it as a fantasy. One reviewer thought his style too realistic. Many years later, a ship traveling in the same waters happened upon a glorious, beautiful, uncharted island. A crew went forth to explore. They were met by a patrol who ushered them firmly to headquarters. When it was seen that the men meant no harm, they were freed, and their ship was allowed to come into the port of the island's bustling metropolis. The men were quite surprised to see such an advanced society so far removed from the rest of civilization. Newspapers contained all the sections of any modern daily current events, crime, economic issues, reports, sports, fashion, the usual range of advertisement. "You know," said one of the crew, "as a child, I once heard a story about a beautiful island just like this. A man claimed to have lived there for several years. He described it as one of the loveliest places he had ever seen, with the kindness and warmest people. In many ways, he could have been describing this very place, except that he said it was very primitive, and there was one other thing also. He said, if you could feature this, everyone went around constantly tied to someone else by their umbilical cords." "Oh, I remember him," the tour guide said, as he ushered them all into a waiting hovercraft. "That's just the way it used to be here," he continued, straining above the noise of the motors as they exploded into full throttle. "But after he left," the pilot shouted back through the spray, "we all cut them off."
A little strange. Remember, the theme for today's class is bonds and binds. And I love the moral that he provides. I want to ask you to explain it. I think we'll hear it clearly. The umbilical cord is infinitely elastic. The umbilical cord is infinitely elastic. Let's just start with that first question. Are civilization and bliss basically incompatible? And this touches on some of our eschatological hopes about what we think will happen when the world comes to an end. Is bliss and civilization incompatible? Can those be held together? What do you think?
They're not incompatible as long as you're high up enough in society to enjoy leisure.
Thank you. Thank you. What else? Bliss and civilization? Incompatible? What do you think? Maybe that second question will kind of elucidate some more of the first. Are growth and feeling good mutually incompatible? Yeah, Dean.
I think both are compatible, civilization and bliss and growth and feeling good, because anytime I've ever had a goal and you accomplish the goal, you just pause very briefly and appreciate it before you start looking for the next goal.
Yeah.
And I think bliss and feeling good and growth is enjoying the process and what you're currently doing, rather than feeling like you're going to finally be happy whenever you accomplish something and you accomplish it and feel kind of empty.
Yeah. Who else wants to comment on that? The relationship between feeling good and growth. Yeah, Karen.
In my career, I was exposed to a number of super overachieving people. Not always the nicest people, but they did accomplish a lot of things. So perhaps it's true that that if you have a really loving home and set of friends, that you are not encouraged, you are not, you don't have the internal drive to expand society,
Yeah.
achieve greatness.
Yeah. Who else? Think, as coming to Trent, but think in terms of a fable, right? This is not a question about how hard should the football coach make the team run in order that they'll be ready for the next game. Like, this is, like, take it to the extreme limit. Like, every dissatisfaction, discomfort, and need is constantly met by a caregiver. What happens to the child in that case if the mother is always meeting every need without any pain or struggle or challenge or strife? Just think in that terms of the fable. Yeah, Trent.
Yeah, that's kind of along the lines of what I was thinking. Thinking of growth in two different ways. One is striving beyond maybe what one has previously done and accomplishing it and feeling good about it. But the other is the growth that comes from failure and humiliation and gained self-awareness, and maybe gained compassion that comes from that kind of growth, where it's not always pleasant in the moment, might lead to more joy,
Yeah.
but there's some unpleasantness involved with it.
Yeah, thank you. Think about the island. I mean, I think Friedman's giving us this kind of ridiculous situation to make us ask ourselves, was it better before or after? Like, do we really idealize a situation in which everything is perfect, even if the consequence of that is kind of stagnation in a way? It's not as simple as this is a fable, right? But like, how easy is it for us to assume that conflict and strife and need and want and struggle are all bad and should be sort of swept away at all cost? I think the result is pretty ridiculous. Yeah, Lisa. Yep.
I was struck by the language of it too, the primitive versus civilization. Was it primitive, or had they found a way to find their values and priorities, and would we want to be there full throttle? And the way that he described the island after he left. But it also, kind of off topic, but I just keep coming back to this article I read in the Atlantic about attachment. And this is interesting. It's a fascinating article, but it talks about how culturally we're having a lot more families have grown children, and their parents are not in communication, or what's the word I'm looking for? Not abandonment or attachment, but estranged. Thank you. Yeah, are estranged. And it talked about how previous generations had this duty, responsibility, proximity, need, and now there's more, as we've grown and been a little bit more independent, that it's this emotional response to I need boundaries, I need this emotional relationship that's not working for me, and so there's more estrangement, and that adult children and also their parents do not know how to handle this, particularly the parents, because that would never have crossed their mind to have an estrangement with their own parents because they felt this duty responsibility. It was just fascinating to me to think about that culturally, that they're seeing the shift, and counselors were talking about how many of these cases that are coming to them with families who are choosing to just cut off instead of dig in and try and solve those problems of conflict. And
Yeah, look at number 7, right? To what extent is the inability to be alone the source of all base emotions and of crime? Like our inability to be alone or to let somebody else be alone, one of the greatest gifts we can give our children is to help them enjoy themselves. Alone time, that's hard. It is hard in a world where screens and connection are that close. It's hard to learn to be alone, right? Some of us extroverts have a harder time being alone than others. But one of the great gifts we can do is to not be afraid of that, and then to kind of dig into the fear of being alone, the fear of estrangement, and to have those conversations, especially with those we find most dear. Look at number 9. Do you think this island would be a good location for a retreat? And if so, why or why not? Some of y'all are like, no, right? Yeah? Others? Yeah? Huh. Anybody want to expound upon that? Yeah, Ray?
Well, you're talking about it in its original state or after
Question,
they
good
come
question.
back?
Good question.
In the original state, yes, of course, because that's what we do when we have a retreat, is we escape the pressures of our civilization for a while.
Yeah, nice perhaps to be the alone person on the island, right? Yeah. Well, as we finish, what do you think Friedman would say about the Garden of Eden and that myth in our identity? What do you think Friedman, if this were a commentary on the Genesis account, before the fall and after the fall, think about the language that the Bible uses to talk about toil and struggle as being a consequence of being sort of evicted from the garden. What do you think his commentary on that sort of fundamental myth in our lives is? What's he saying about the Garden of Eden and that understanding of the fall? Yeah, Ray again.
There's no such thing as virtue until it's been tested.
Thank you. What else? What else would you say about the garden?
I'd say he'd probably say it was inevitable.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, think of all the things that we enjoy that are a product, either directly or indirectly, of the shadow side of humanity. I'm not suggesting that that we should embrace it, but think about how different our lives would be without greed, without the unequal allocation of resources. About Friedman seems to be suggesting there's something about creativity and maybe even markets that result in some of the technology that we have. I'm not sure that holds, but think about how different our culture, our civilization would be without conflict, without strife, without greed, without self-seeking. We don't like those things, but I think it might be a little naive to suggest that simply going back to the Garden of Eden, would make everything perfect. It might make everything perfect, but it would be different. I think it's complicated. I think it's more complicated than that, and I don't like the way Friedman uses primitive and non-primitive cultures. I think that sounds a lot like a European sort of perspective, but I do think it illuminates for me some sort of questions about what are my assumptions about the way the world should be versus the way the world is. Closing comments about that? Yeah, right?
The prophets in the Bible are mainly unhappy, driven people. And it turns on how you understand the phrase feeling good in question 2. A prophet only feels good if they're fulfilling their divine mission, which often involves making established people uncomfortable, but that's because the prophet has a vision of growth for the religious tradition that they're in.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, you can buy, it's a cheap book. You can buy, it's about $12 to buy a copy of the book. Some more fables are interesting. I commend them to you. Maybe we'll return to this series again. Thank y'all for being here. Next week, we start an Advent series. We will be, the children will come and sing an Advent canticle to us, and we'll look at some of the canticle songs and poems of Advent. I hope to see you there. Thanks.